Well, we're going to continue our walk through the Bible tonight, and we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. For those that haven't been to these before, they're not so much preachy, or they aren't meant to be so much preachy, as kind of teachy. So what we do is we just spend a little bit of time thinking about the overall pattern of a book of the Bible. And we've been exploring, or we started exploring the Gospels. I believe the last 3 talks are released online. Somebody was saying to me they're relieved about that because there was so much information in them. And they wanted to go back through them and sort of unpack it all. So if you want to get some background to what we're doing tonight, then those are online. There's 3 talks, background to the Gospels, and then 2 on Mark. And tonight we're going to move to Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel is the first Gospel in the New Testament. It's there because they erroneously thought, probably in the 5th century, that it was actually the first Gospel written. Now, we all know it isn't. What's the first Gospel written? Oh, good. I'm glad somebody was awake last week. So Mark's Gospel is the first Gospel that is written. And Matthew came subsequently, but became the favorite Gospel of the church, really because it combines an awful lot of the teaching of Jesus, which Mark doesn't. And it actually reproduces an awful lot of Mark. There's about 90% of Mark reproduced in Matthew. So if you wanted to express it really simplistically, you would say that Matthew is Mark plus the teaching of Jesus. And that kind of gets you Matthew's Gospel. I'm hoping to show you it's a little more complicated than that. But it's interesting, the relationship of Mark to Matthew. Because when we compare the two, we can see subtle differences in the way that stories are told, the emphasis, or even the details that are included. And additional details are often put into stories or omitted from stories. And when that happens, we can kind of say, why are they doing that? And New Testament scholars spend an awful lot of time sort of exploring that. And one of the things I wanted to start with tonight was one of those stories. You know from our study of Mark that one of the critical episodes in Mark's Gospel was found in Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30. Jesus travels up to Caesarea Philippi, and he arrives up there at the top of what is today modern-day Israel. And then he asks them, who do you say that I am? And people give various answers. Some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist. And then Peter says, you are the Christ. Okay? And that's it. That's what he says. And then what happens is Jesus turns around and says, get behind me, Satan. And actually, the episode as it's told in Mark doesn't look that great for Peter. He doesn't really shine that much. In fact, we saw, although we think Peter was behind the Gospel of Mark, it's Peter's preaching, that Peter doesn't really blow his own trumpet. He's often showing himself as a little out of touch, not realizing what's really going on, not really aware of what's happening. And actually, the end of the Gospel, they still haven't got it. And we see that. I mean, that's epitomized in that story in Mark chapter 8. Yet, if you look at the equivalent story in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, you'll see it's really different. And this story, and we can see the way that Matthew copies Mark, because you'll discover that there's the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and then this episode. And in Mark, we have the feeding of the 5,000 and then this episode. And if you look at it in Greek, it actually is reproducing some of the language, the exact language of the Greek. So if you were a teacher marking this, you would immediately see plagiarism going on. However, there is a really subtle difference that goes. Verses 13 through to verses 16 really follow what Mark says. But then we get to what Peter actually says. And Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And it says, Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Okay, and that's the end of the Mark. That's what Mark says. You are the Christ. You are a king. basically, what's happening in Mark's gospel. But then Matthew adds, the Son of the living God. So suddenly we've got something else. Oh, Peter's not just saying he's the Christ, but he's actually recognizing the deity of Christ. And then Jesus turns around and says to him, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." First of all, Peter is not only then, he doesn't look like a numpty. Suddenly Jesus says, "Hey, Peter, you are phenomenally blessed. And not only are you phenomenally blessed, you have special revelation in order to understand this. So you are phenomenally clued up." And in terms of the guidance of the Spirit. And then Jesus goes on and he says, "I tell you, Peter, that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Peter's not only got special revelation, he's slide 4, sorry, Anthony. He's not only got special revelation, sorry, slide 5, Ian. He's not only got special revelation, he's actually going to be the foundation of the church. Just as an aside from the history of Christianity, that statement, Peter, your name is the rock, and on this foundation we will build this church. Roman Catholics and Protestants had very different interpretations of that. Roman Catholics believed it meant Peter was the founding father of the church. And Peter obviously was the first, supposedly the first Pope of Rome, and therefore Rome and the Pope is the foundation of the church. Protestants objected to that interpretation, and they said that the rock isn't Peter, it's the confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that's the rock on which the church is built, the profession of Jesus as Christ and the Son of the living God. You can make up your own minds where you want to sit on that one. But anyway, but so we have this statement. So suddenly Peter's got special revelation. Peter's the foundation of the church. And then he says, he goes on, Jesus goes on and says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." He's saying, not only are you the foundation of the church, but you are going to have special authority. Wow, I mean, this is so different from Mark, isn't it? And he throws in there, not only has Peter got special revelation, the foundation of the church, special authority where he can loose and bind things, but you are going to storm the gates of Hades. And the idea here is some people think that it says the gates of hell will not prevail against you as if we're getting attacked. But actually, it's not that at all. It's actually the church is going to go on the offensive and nothing is going to stop it. That's what Jesus is saying. You're going to bust the gates open to death itself. You're going to break that power because the church of Jesus Christ is going to be triumphant and militant. Now, just think about it. Mark's account, Matthew's account. Wow. Radically different. Radically different. And a lot of detail is included in Matthew that isn't there in Mark, that either Mark omitted or Matthew or didn't know about, and Matthew has added. So suddenly we have all of this. Now the question is, why are they doing that? Now remember, if we go back to Mark's gospel, remember the disciples throughout the story, never ever got it. They never actually understood who Jesus was. They never understood Jesus' mission. And remember how it finishes. It finishes shockingly that when they do get it, possibly at the resurrection, we're still not quite sure, they actually go away and don't tell anyone. And everybody goes, what is going on in this gospel? The disciples are a disaster. See, in Matthew's gospel, the disciples are not a disaster. And from the beginning, they seem to get that Jesus is divine, and they seem to understand his teaching. Can we go to slide 2? And we see this reiterated again in another comparison, which is the story of Jesus walking on the water. Here we have Matthew. Well, Mark tells the story. Remember, there's the feeding of the 5,000, and then Jesus goes out. The disciples go out in a boat, and then it said that Jesus comes to them walking on the water. And in Mark's gospel, they're terrified and afraid. And then when Jesus arrives, they still don't get it. And it tells us they were amazed and their hearts were hardened. So Jesus walks on water. You would think you would start to get something then. But in Mark's gospel, they're still clueless. They're a good Scottish word. They are dunderheads. They just aren't getting it in Mark. In Matthew, look at the response. Not only does Peter get out the boat, which he doesn't in Mark, but at the end of the story, the disciples worship him and say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." They recognize Jesus and worship him after that event. Do you remember in Mark? Here's a tester for you. In Mark, who was the only person that got Jesus was the Son of God? Do you remember? The centurion. That's right. He's the only guy that actually sees Jesus as the Son of God in the whole of Mark. He's the only guy. And we think he probably sponsored the book to see it written. But here in Matthew's gospel, the disciples totally get it and they understand Jesus' teaching. Now, why is this? Why is there difference? And this is kind of what academics, New Testament scholars get paid for, because they spend a lot of time asking these questions. Why is there such a difference in emphasis? And it's to do with the audience that is being addressed and the situation that that audience is facing. So if you're a good communicator and you go and talk to a bunch of 5-year-olds, hopefully you don't talk in the same way as you would go and talk to a group of postgraduate university students. Well, maybe. But you wouldn't. You would adapt it because it's a different audience. So you change the way that you communicate and the emphasis that you bring. And we see this throughout the Gospels. The Gospels aren't concerned with the precise detail in the way that we would recount history. What they're concerned about is bringing the truth behind the events out. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to let you see what's going on behind the actual event. They're trying to draw out. Doesn't mean that it's not history. It is based in history and stuff that happens. But what they're trying to do is draw out what is happening behind it. And so we see the gospel writers doing this. What is Mark trying to draw out? Well, Mark is trying to address a group of people who are facing persecution, possibly war, possibly uncertainty. They're certainly suffering for their faith. And Mark wants them to understand that the only way you are going to get Jesus is by going the way of the cross, by recognizing that you diminish and that you have to descend in order to ascend. That the only way you will understand Jesus is if you take up your cross and you follow him. And actually, as we work through this persecution and suffering, we will come to see that Jesus is Lord. And that's kind of where Mark is pitching his tent. Matthew is confronting a very different situation. He's facing a situation where the church is seeking credibility. The church is having to make itself, the church is trying to project a degree of authority and competence in order that people will respond to the teaching of the leadership, but also those who were challenging the church would also be silenced. So there was a kind of searching for credibility from within and without. Because if you portray the disciples and the leaders of the church all as numpties, there's a real problem. Usually people aren't that great at following what numpties say. And certainly those outside of the church that were criticizing Christianity, they could say, well, your leadership and the people who are supposedly representing Jesus to you, they just don't know what they are doing. So the church was looking to present authoritative pronouncement, and by providing the fact that the disciples recognized that Jesus was Lord and they understood his teaching, it gave them an authority so that they could make pronouncements both to the church and congregation, but also to those outside of it. So this tells us a little bit about the context that Matthew is writing into. He's writing into a context where there are two groups that are making competing claims. Where there are two groups that are saying there are two versions of Judaism. I'm sure you've met those Christians who say, well, you know, we're descended from Judaism, and we'll go to Judaism and we'll understand it, and then that will teach us Christianity. And when that's kind of expressed, it's actually not an accurate reflection of what happened. You see, the Judaism of Jesus doesn't exist anymore. The Judaism of Jesus was based around a temple and a sacrificial system. And that was what you did. But the problem was that system was corrupted. And so people were looking for alternatives to it. It actually really got done in because in 70 CE, the whole temple system was destroyed. And so that form of Judaism disappeared forever. You can still see it amongst the Samaritans near Nablus, but other than that, it just disappeared. And then there were two competing claims about what is true Judaism. Who are the inheritors of that tradition of the covenants of Abraham and Israel and David? Have you ever seen people disputing over an inheritance? Maybe a stepmother has taken all the money and the sons are saying, wait a minute, we want the money. And they fight, and this is what is happening, and this is the background to Matthew's gospel. They're fighting for the title as the inheritor of Judaism, the inheritor of the covenant with Abraham, of Israel and David. And there were two different versions, or two competing versions of Judaism. We call one Christianity now, but it actually was a version of Judaism, and that's how they saw it, versus another version of Judaism. And these two, Jesus warns about this other form of Judaism when he criticizes the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And to understand what was happening was, the Pharisees, and this is after Jesus, were recognizing that the temple system was broken and corrupt. And people had been hoping that it would get reformed, but people had come to realize that it wasn't going to get reformed. And so they began to teach that what we need is a form of Judaism without a temple. And what's that form of Judaism going to look like? And what they said was, let's go to the next slide. And what they said is, it's going to be about reading and studying the Bible. And they said some really cool things. They actually said that if you read about going to the temple, it's the same as actually going to the temple. Right? And just think about that for a minute. Read about going to the temple is the same as going to the temple. So we don't actually need a temple. We just need to be able to read about it. And if we read about it, that's just the same thing. And that created quite an introspective Judaism. It created a Judaism which would study the law to try and understand it. It also created quite an esoteric Judaism where you have all these different interpretations of the law going on. It also taught that anyone who doesn't measure up should be excluded. Because the law, these laws are now what it's all about. It's not about a temple, it's about conformity to the laws. So anyone who doesn't conform to the law must be excluded, and we need to keep ourselves ethnically pure. So let's go subjective, let's exclude everyone, and let's stay ethnically pure. That was rabbinic Judaism that was evolving. Counter to this was the message of Christianity. And Christianity was saying something amazing. And Matthew shows this. It begins with the living Christ. And this image of not a temple that you went physically to, but an image of a new temple which was braced around the presence of God based in Jesus. And so when the resurrected Christ stood in the midst of the community of God's people, a new temple was born. Like the ancient temple of old, but now the living and true temple was born. And Christ was Emmanuel, God with us in that temple. There are actually 3 points you'll see in Matthew, 3 key texts. The first one in chapter 1, where the angel tells Mary, or tells Joseph rather, he will be known as Emmanuel, God with us. Then in Matthew 18, where it says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there am I in the midst. And then right at the end, the last verse, where Jesus says, behold, I am with you to the end of the age. Do any of you remember watching E.T.? E.T. borrows that line at the end of it. It doesn't really work for E.T., but at the end of Matthew's gospel, this phenomenal sense of Jesus is risen and he is present. You know, even tonight, as we sit here in church, we believe that Christ is risen and he is present. And as we come together, we become the temple of the living God. And they believed that the presence of Christ through his death and resurrection freed us to live out a new way of living. That this Jesus, who and our encounter with the living God as the resurrected Christ, enabled us to be freed so that we began to live in a new way and follow a new pattern. And you're going to see in Matthew's gospel, it lays out this new way and this new pattern. The resurrected Christ enables us to be changed. You see, for Matthew, we talk about justification and sanctification, meaning you're saved because of what Jesus did, and then you are meant to start changing your life. But some people just think, oh, we're saved and we don't have to change our life. But for Matthew, the essence of the message of this new temple was that we would be transformed and we would embrace the teaching of Jesus because Jesus was resurrected and a resurrected presence in the midst of God's people. And guess what? Everyone was going to be invited into this new reality. So you were actually going to see not just an exclusion, but actually everyone, Jew, Gentile, slave, free, was going to be invited into this new temple. Question, which version of Judaism do you think was going to grow? Just take a guess. Christianity. But it was claiming, it's really important, it wasn't claiming it was rejecting Judaism, it was claiming it was the true inheritor of Judaism. And so what Matthew wanted to do in writing his gospel was he wanted to show this. So when you read Jesus' teaching in Matthew's gospel, what you'll see is that Jesus is very keen to emphasize that they are not rejecting the Old Testament. They're not saying, let's get rid of all the Old Testament. Let's get rid of all the things that used to be part of Judaism, and then we're going to start up a brand new thing like a blank sheet of paper. No, they're not doing that. They're actually saying, we are the true inheritors of all of this. But what Jesus is doing is reinterpreting it and applying it in a new way. But the reinterpretation that Jesus is bringing isn't some new innovation. He's just recovering what the true purpose of the law was. So for instance, people taught that you should be excluded if you didn't keep puritanical behaviors. And Jesus came and he said, no, don't you understand? The law is about caring for people and looking after people. And so if you are applying the law in a way that excludes people and alienates people and wounds people, you're missing the point. That wasn't what the purpose of the law was. The purpose was to love people. And so if your application of the law doesn't reflect love, guess what? You haven't understood the law. We're not getting rid of the law. We're fulfilling the law. And that's what Jesus means in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, where he says, I have not come to wipe out the law. I've come to fulfill the law. And so we see this important emphasis. It's really interesting in Mark. Mark was more almost suggesting we're getting rid of all that. In Mark's gospel, remember when Jesus enters Jerusalem, he attacks the temple. And in Mark's gospel, that attack on the temple is seen as the prelude to its destruction, because Jesus is saying this whole thing needs to be gotten rid of, and we need to have a brand new thing that's wonderful and innovative. And Matthew is kind of coming almost as a corrective to this, and it doesn't really see it as getting rid of the temple. It sees it as a cleansing of the temple. You see, Jesus comes and he cleanses the temple so the temple can be what it is meant to be. And actually, after that event, in Mark, Jesus never relates to the temple thereafter after that event. But in Matthew, it's brilliant. We actually see what a temple really should be after Jesus cleanses it. Because we see blind people and lame people who shouldn't be in the temple coming to Jesus and being healed there. We see children praising the Son of David in the temple. And we see Jesus teaching there. There's a wee image of the church there that's going on in Matthew as he shows this community. And so we have this reinterpretation of the law so that they are the true inheritors. As Matthew, as this is communicated, we have the story. We're told that Matthew wrote this gospel, although actually nowhere in the gospel do we ever have that claim. But we do have a little autograph. And again, we talked about the autograph that we saw in Mark. There's a little autograph in Matthew. If you look at the story of the calling of Matthew, which happens in chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, you'll actually see that Matthew uses the name Matthew, whereas in the other Gospels he's called Levi. And Levi was a priest, and it was the name of the priestly family. And yet here we have him using the name Matthew, and it's kind of saying like, and if you read his calling, it actually says that he was a tax collector, and he invited all his tax collectory friends round for tea. And then the Pharisees complained at it. They're going, what are you doing associating with all these people? And then he says, Jesus said, well, I'm come to call the sick, not the healthy. And then he says this, I deserve mercy, not sacrifice. And it's like Matthew got it. Matthew understood that the whole of the Old Testament wasn't actually about the sacrificial system. It wasn't about the priesthood. It was about the mercy of God being extended to those on the margins. And so there's a little autograph that's kind of in there in the story of Matthew, as we see him saying Jesus desires mercy, not sacrifice, and the healing of the sick. So, 3 quick themes that we see in Matthew that we need to understand. In order to underline this, Matthew draws out 3 themes, and they run throughout the gospel, but you actually see them very vividly in the birth narrative right at the beginning. The first theme is that Jesus is a new Moses. Second theme is that he fulfills the prophecies of the Old Testament. And the third thing is that he is the Messiah, the promised Davidic Savior. But the way that messianic claim is worked out is different from what everybody anticipated. And so we see these 3 themes being worked out in Matthew. The first theme, that he is a new Moses. Almost every page of Matthew is screaming out, he's a new Moses. In Deuteronomy, I think it's 23, it's actually a prophecy that's made. As Moses is dying, he said, as I die, there is going to be a new Moses that is going to come, and he will lead you into all truth. So this is a prophecy that Moses makes. And what Matthew wants to do is say Jesus is now this new Moses. He's the guy who's coming to interpret actually what Moses really meant. Because we've missed it. We've misinterpreted it. And so to communicate that Jesus is the new Moses, Matthew gives us lots and lots of indication of this. If you look at the birth narrative, remember the story of Moses? It starts with all the boys, all the firstborn in Egypt being killed, all the Israeli children being killed. What happens in the story of Jesus? We have Herod killing all these children under 2. You'll see then, as the story goes on, Jesus runs away to Egypt. Moses ended up in Egypt and then comes out of Egypt. Jesus comes out of Egypt. As they come out of Egypt, Moses passes through the sea, the Red Sea. Jesus passes through the waters of baptism. Moses is in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. The law is received on a mountain. Matthew 5, the law of Jesus, this new law, is received on a mountain. At the end, we again see Jesus leaving the disciples on a mountain, just as Moses died on Mount Nebo. And he calls his instruction commandments, just like Moses. We could go through it all over and over again. But what Matthew is trying to say is, this is the new Moses. This is the guy who's bringing the true reinterpretation of the law. And he actually restructures the book in order to reflect this truth. Let's go to the next slide. The book is structured around an introduction, which is the birth of the Messiah. Then we have 5 books, like the 5 books of the Old Testament that Moses wrote: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We actually have 5 sermons, or we'll see in a moment, they're actually narrative plus sermon. And then a conclusion which talks about the death and resurrection of the Messiah. So Matthew's gospel is designed around 5 books or sermons. And these teaching blocks, let's go to the next thing, and we'll see them. The book 1 runs from chapter 1 to chapter 7. And each one of these blocks starts with narrative, so it tells story, and then it gives us instruction and teaching. So you have 5 sermons that Jesus delivers. So you have introduction, and then some narrative, and then a sermon. First sermon's called Sermon on the Mount. It's all about relationships. Next section is in book 2, begins in chapter 8, goes to chapter 10, verse 42. The sermon is in chapter 10. We have narrative and sermon, and it deals with mission. Book 3 happens in chapter 14. Again, it runs from 13, rather. It runs from chapter 11 to 13. And again, we see narrative and sermon, and it's all about parables of discipleship, how the work of the kingdom happens. Book 4 has the sermon in chapter 18, but the material runs from 1353 through 1835, narrative and sermon. And it deals with patterns of church and community. And book 5 deals with, the sermon runs from 23 through 25, and it's all about end times. But the narrative section runs from chapter 19 through 25. And it deals all with the future of the kingdom. So we have these 5 sections, just like Moses. So here we have this new Moses. And remember when Jesus stands up in the first of these sermons, in Matthew chapter 5, he stands up and he says, "You've heard it said this, but I want to tell you what it's really meant to do. And I'm going to tell you this." He, just to give you one instance of this, he talks about adultery. And in the Old Testament, adultery was actually the sin of stealing. And women could, if they slept with someone other than their husband, committed adultery because it was seen to be stealing a man's possession. But if a man slept with someone other than his wife, it wasn't necessarily adultery if she didn't belong to anyone. So if a man slept with a maidservant or he slept with a prostitute, in the Old Testament, that was okay. And you'll read lots of stories where that happens. Jesus came along and he said, "Who thought you could read the law in that way?" You know, you've read the law by saying, well, it doesn't say that a man can't sleep with maidservants and prostitutes, so it's okay. 1 Corinthians 6, you know, when Paul says, you say it's lawful. That's what they were saying. They were saying to go to prostitutes is lawful. It's not prohibited by the Old Testament. And Jesus comes and he says, don't you understand? You've totally misunderstood what the law is trying to say. Actually, a woman is like a man, and they're both equal in that relationship. And therefore, what applies to a woman applies equally to a man. And he redefines adultery and changes the whole nature of sexual ethics. Anyway, that's another set of sermons. But that's the sort of thing that Jesus is doing in Matthew's gospel. Secondly, then, he's showing the fulfillment of prophecies. Constantly throughout, he's saying, oh, if you again look at the birth narrative, it says all this took place to fulfill what the Lord said through the prophets. So Jesus is constantly reiterating that the Old Testament is being fulfilled in what is happening here, in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. It is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So what is happening in the Old Testament is working itself out here presently in these things. Again, it's really important as Christians we understand that, because there's been a history of anti-Semitism in Christianity. And there's been a history because people have alienated themselves from that tradition, the covenants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and David that constituted our inheritance as the people of God. And we've alienated it. But Jesus is wanting to say, understand that what we're about is the fulfillment of what begins in Genesis 1, and it's working itself out. Lastly, we see the idea that the fulfillment of prophecy is that Jesus has come as the Messiah. And people were looking towards the Messiah, and they believed that the Messiah would come and he would deliver them from the Romans. That's what they were anticipating, that a king would come and he would deliver them from the Romans. And Matthew wants to say Jesus is that promised Messiah. He is the one who has come to deliver. And he wants to emphasize that he came to deliver people from their sins. And this is a very important emphasis that he makes. You see, the name Jesus is the word Joshua, and it means save, the one who saves or delivers. And people were anticipating that a Jesus would come and he would deliver them from the Romans. But Matthew says, no, you've read the Old Testament wrong. The Messiah is coming to deliver us from the sins. And what he meant by sins was not stealing sweets. I can't say from Woolworths. Stealing sweets from wherever you steal sweets from now. He's not saying that. He's not saying, oh, it's, don't lie or whatever. He's talking about the patterns of our life that are contrary to the way that we are meant to live. And he's saying Jesus has come to set us free from these things. And so he is Joshua, Jesus, the one who comes to save us from our sins. And then he explains how that is done. It is done through him being Emmanuel, God with us, as Jesus dies and is resurrected. Interestingly, in the Last Supper, Mark and Luke tell the story, and Jesus explains about the bread and the wine, being his blood and the bread being his body. But only in Matthew does he say, this blood saves people from their sins. What he's saying is my death and resurrection is going to release people from their past. They are going to know the presence of God, which is going to bring a freedom to them so that they can break with the patterns of their old life to enjoy the patterns of this new life that I've just laid out in the 5 sermons I preached in Matthew's Gospel. And so you will live, knowing deliverance from sin. Again, if we turn to the story I began with in Matthew 14, we actually see all the details of this demonstrated in that narrative. Remember, Peter gets out the boat as the storm is raging. And as Jesus is walking. And Jesus says to him, don't doubt. Don't be afraid. And Peter said, if you tell me, I can do it. And Jesus says, come. And so Peter gets out the boat. And remember what happens as he gets out the boat? He starts to sink. And he cries, Lord, save me. And what Peter is doing there by saying, Lord, he's saying, you are God. And then he's saying, release me from that pattern, that way of living. Lord, save me. And then we see that as they get into the boat, the disciples worship Jesus as the Son of God. See, Matthew's image of what Christianity is about the resurrected Christ being the presence of God amongst us, releasing us from the former patterns of living to live out the teaching of Jesus in this world in a way that reaches out to the ends of the earth and invite others into this community shaped by the teaching of Jesus and his resurrected presence. Matthew's emphasis. Let's pray.